Okay. So welcome everyone to our second RAC meeting for the Focused Investment Partnership Program rules. We will start with a round of introductions. We'll do OEB staff and RAC members, and we'll do a quick agenda review and then hop right into it. So I'll start. So my name is Eric Hartstein. I'm OEB Senior Policy Coordinator. And we'll go to folks as I see you on my screen. Jillian.
Good morning, everyone. Jillian McCarthy, Partnerships Coordinator with OEB.
Eric Williams.
Hi, everybody. Eric Williams, Restoration Grants Manager at OEB. Good to see you.
Audrey.
Good morning, and I'm Audrey Hatch, the Conservation Outcomes Coordinator on OEB staff. Thanks.
And Denise.
Good morning, everybody. Denise Hoffert, and I'm one of OEB's Partnerships Coordinators.
Jesse.
Morning, Jesse Steele, Executive Director at the Grand Island Model Watershed.
Welcome, Jesse. Leah.
Morning, everybody. My name is Leah Tai. I'm a hydrologist with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service.
Welcome, Leah. Herb.
Morning, everybody. Herb Winters, Gillum SWCD.
Morning, Herb. Chris.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Chris Lorian. I work for Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife in the Fish Conservation Recovery Program, and I'm the Native Fish Conservation Coordinator.
Welcome, Chris. Let's go to Haley.
Good morning. My name is Haley Lutz, and I'm Executive Director for the Coos Watershed Association.
Good morning, Haley. Melissa.
Good morning, Melissa Petschauer, Harney Basin Ecological Coordinator here at High Desert Partnership.
Thanks, Melissa. Let's go to Colin, who is filling in for Christy today.
Yep, Colin Jones, Habitat Assessment and Monitoring Program Manager with the Tillamook Estuaries Partnership. And as Eric said, filling in for Christy this session and the next one while she's on vacation.
Great, and thanks for doing that, Colin. Really appreciate it. Let's go to Brad.
Morning, Brad Nye with the Oregon Desert Land Trust.
Morning, Brad. And Andy.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Andy Spurker with Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, Private Forestry Grant Coordinator. Sorry for my camera. I'll get it fixed up.
No worries. Thanks, Andy. Okay, so for today, we are planning on going through some of the revisions that were made to the first sections of the rules that we all reviewed at the first RAC meeting. Some of them are pretty substantial, so we'll take some time going through there. And then we have the initial discussion on the next sections of the FIP rules. Again, some pretty meaty topics in there as well. So we're planning on taking a break at 10 o'clock after we review the revisions to the first sections of the rules. And then again at 11:15, followed by public comments at 11:30, and then we will wrap things up and get everybody out of here by noon. So any questions on the agenda? Okay. In advance of the verbal comment, so I do want to acknowledge that we did receive written comments. Ken Beerley, who's here today, Daniel Newberry, David Cruz, and Gary Young all submitted a written comment that was sent out to you last Friday afternoon. And we'll be touching on some of the topics that were brought up during that during some of those written comments. So with that, Jillian, if you don't mind popping up the document, thank you. And the size looks good to me, but if that works for everybody else. Seeing some head nods, thumbs up. Okay, so we're going to start back up at the top. I don't believe we had anything different in the purpose section here than what we talked about during the first RAC meeting. Where we did have some pretty substantial edits is in the definitions section. We attempted here in the first few sections to have the blue, what's in blue is sort of the new edits. What's in red, well, I guess it's in blue and purple is the new edits, and what's red is what was discussed during the first RAC meeting. So I think that's mostly the case. You still might see some red edits that are fairly new edits, but for the most part, I think the blue and purple are the new stuff. So we removed in 1 for the focus investment partnership, as we had talked about at the first RAC meeting, removing language around clear, and then you'll see a little bit later on that we actually removed measurable, and just kept to the ecological outcomes. And that's in line with some of the definitions that we have in our strategic action plan guidance, as we're really looking to align definitions across all the documents in use for the FIP program. So in 1, we also removed the integrated and results-oriented approaches as RAC members suggested at the first RAC meeting. So any questions in 1? So moving down in the new number 3, which is the strategic action plan definition, we added some more detail here on the definition, including that it is something that will be required at the time of application. Any questions on that? Okay. High-performing partnership, as suggested by the RAC last meeting, we removed the word formal from decision-making process. And then in core partners, we don't have any suggested edits on the screen right now. But we do have, I think, a possible edit here that we'd like to talk over with the RAC. That would be, so core partners, we felt this definition is a little light. And so the suggested language is core partners are identified in the initiative level grant application as signatories to the FIP partnership agreement and are eligible to apply for project level grants to provide capacity for partnership coordination and work plan implementation. And Jillian, I can say that again, or I can put it in the chat if that's helpful, and then you can put it into this. So Jillian, I just put it in the chat if you want to copy and paste it into the that comment box.
Yeah, I can't see. I just realized I can't see the chat while I'm sharing my screen. So I'll grab it. I'll grab it after.
Okay.
Can I ask a quick question about core partners?
Yeah, go ahead, Melissa.
I guess my question is around timing. Since these grants, you know, the FIP grants span over 6 years, is there any way within like the application of I guess my question is, once you have your core partners and all your signatories, if, you know, 3 years in, you have a new partner that now has capacity maybe to like lean in more with the collaborative and not necessarily be ones that are spearheading projects, but want to be identified as a core partner, are they able to join in later on, or is it kind of like a one and done deal now that once that application's set in and you've identified your core partners in the 6 years of developing these projects, you can't add any additional core partners? Is that correct?
Actually, no. We've had some partnerships that have added core partners at some point during their FIP initiative, and we just ask that they're added formally, and that information is then also given to OWEB. So as like a signatory to the strategic action plan or the governance documents.
Okay, that's good to know. Yeah, I don't think I knew that, and I'm not sure if it's lined out anywhere in the rules, or if that's maybe important to recognize. Because I thought as soon as you submitted and you had your core partners, you couldn't adjust that. But that might be something that I just hadn't caught in the past.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yep. Jillian, I can read kind of slower the definition here that we were contemplating. So after application, it would be as signatories to the FIP partnership agreement. Are eligible to apply for project level grants to provide capacity for partnership coordination and work plan implementation.
Thanks.
No, thank you. I think I missed an and in there. So after partnership agreement, yeah, and are eligible. Okay. How do folks feel about that proposed edit to core partners?
Eric, this is Jesse. Just a quick question for you. and this, I should probably know the answer to this, but what makes the core partners eligible to apply for the project level grants?
Well, there's probably a technical answer to that, which is when we set up the online grant offering, we go by and check who can actually access the applications, and we check box on the core partners. So nobody else can actually access the grant applications except for those core partners. So that's the technical answer.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions or comments on this definition? Denise.
Yeah, I just wanted to say I looked at the partnership agreement. Someone asked, you know, didn't know like how do we add people, and it does say in the partnership agreement with OWEB that when partnerships are awarded a FIP, they sign an agreement with OWEB that outlines the roles and responsibilities of OWEB and the partnerships. And in there it says it's the partnership's discretion whether to add new members. So we do have language that says that in the partnership agreement. So.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Denise, for that confirmation. Okay. Anything else on core partners at this time? All right, not seeing anything. We added some edits here in 6, 7, 8, and 9 for conservation actions, conservation outputs, ecological outcomes, and theory of change. And so these are all from the strategic action plan guidance that we have up on OWEB's website. We wanted to, as I mentioned earlier, have better alignment in the definitions. And these are either close to verbatim from the strategic action plan guidance or pretty close to, and maybe we're truncated a bit just to make sure the language better fits the rules and maybe could be expanded on a little bit more in the guidance document, but really wanted to get the spirit of that in our administrative rules. So I'll pause here, give folks an opportunity just to read through these and then see if there's questions, comments, or any concerns. Okay, so are these looking pretty clear? I've seen some nodding heads. That's good. And as we kind of go through the rest of the rules, I do want to make sure, since these are some pretty substantial new definitions that, you know, as you go through and make sure that they're aligned with what's included in the rest of the rules. So kind of just keep that in mind. We removed the measurable ecological outcomes. It's been replaced by ecological outcomes. And then in the expert review team definition, which is the new number 10, as we talked about at the first RAC meeting, the reference to agencies represented on the board and other entities has been removed. And we're clarifying that the expert review team is using the evaluation criteria in these rules in 0060. And for the technical review team, we removed this definition in its entirety because we saw it as actually redundant to the definition of the technical review team that's in our overarching Division 5 grant program rules that basically has this definition, so we don't need to be redundant in these rules with that. And then just a little bit of wordsmithing in work plan definition. So any questions on, well, really any of those definitions? Okay, not seeing any. We'll move right along. So one edit we made in board identified priorities. So this is the section that says that at least every 5 years, the board shall adopt ecological priorities. We added that we would develop or have developed a theory of change for each of these board identified ecological priorities. And if you look on our website, we do have a graphic theory of change for each of the current board adopted ecological priorities. And so we thought that it's a helpful document for folks that are interested in applying to the FIP program. And we thought it would be important to kind of hold us to the same or a similar level as we do for applicants. If we're requiring applicants to have a theory of change with their application, then we should have a theory of change for the ecological priorities that the board adopts, regardless if they change or not. So that's why we have this edit proposed in the board identified priorities section. And yes, Colin, thanks. You posted in the chat that the coho habitat populations along the Oregon coast link there. So any questions on or concerns about having theory of change in the board identified priorities section? Okay, not seeing any. Let's go down to eligibility. The proposed edit here is we moved the match language from the section below, which we are proposing for deleting. So the new number C here, or that demonstrate the 25% match is sought and shall be expended within the scope and geography of the initiative application. That was the language from, where Jillian was going down to in the next section. So we are proposing to delete that because this whole section, because it's redundant again to that Division 5 language. We felt that this wasn't really adding anything except for that match piece, which we felt could be placed in the eligibility section. And before we get to if there's any questions or concerns there, I do want to make note that we did say we'll talk about match with the RAC, and I think that will be at our next meeting as we get into some of those sections have a little more meat on them when it comes to match. So we figured that would be the place that we would talk program requirements on match with the RAC. But for now, we have that 25% match language in eligibility. So questions? Not seeing any. Okay, so we're moving pretty far ahead from where we are in the agenda. I think we thought that everybody would want to spend a lot of time in definitions or something. So we're about a half hour ahead. So we did have a break scheduled after we got to these initial set of sections. Do folks want to take a break now, or should we continue on into the new sections? Okay, Leah says onward. And thumbs up, heads nod. Okay. Let's keep going. So, evaluation criteria. So this is a place we figure the RAC will have some thoughts. We do have some suggested edits to the evaluation criteria. The first one being was A, and it's removing the evaluation criterion on the extent to which the initiative addresses a board identified priority. And some of the reasons why are, I think, number one, that we've felt that reviewers have had a difficult time with this particular criterion. And it also kind of gets at some of the other criteria that we have listed here. So we felt that we could delete it and beef up some of the other criteria a little bit to account for some of those elements that may have been included in this particular criterion. But I'll stop there, see if OWEB staff, so Eric, Denise, Jillian, Audrey, if you have any other thoughts on this criterion and why we suggested to remove it.
I can't find my hand while I'm sharing, so I'm raising my real hand. I think so felt like this was perhaps more of an eligibility type of, is it addressing a board identified priority or not? And that's something that could be reviewed as part of the eligibility check that staff do, recognizing what a challenge the criterion has been for reviewers to evaluate.
Yeah. Yep. Thanks, Julian. And Eric.
Yeah, in addition to what Julian just said, I think the other piece, the extent part, really all of the other criteria are doing that. And so we felt that we didn't need to have this criterion that essentially duplicates the set of criteria as a whole.
Yep. Thanks, Eric. So I've seen some nodding heads at this removal of this criterion, but I'll stop and see if there's any questions or concerns if we were to go ahead with suggesting that this criterion be removed.
Eric, this is Chris Lorian. I have just a comment about, I didn't have any problem with this being removed because I do think it was one of the hardest things for reviewers to think about when we were, especially as an evaluation criteria or criterion. I am curious though, those points in the previous section then kind of become a checklist about which programs would be like considered. And so I'm curious how you would decide whether it was a board. Well, I guess a couple of things, like how OWEB would decide whether something addressed a board identified priority, and also kind of definitionally how you would decide how if you had a high performing partnership, just in terms of the actual criteria that you would use for that.
So I think for the first question, Chris, are you asking if this is removed, then how do we go about like determining the eligibility piece that kind of Jillian was talking about?
Right. Like if this is essentially moved to the previous section, like you're saying, it's either a yes or no whether this is the case. And then within that, there's other pieces within this that are getting at how well it addresses that priority. But there is some kind of decision before that about whether it's addressing it. And so do you foresee that being something really inclusive from OWEB's perspective, that it would, or I'm just curious what more in the sense of if something was determined not to address a board identified priority, that would happen then before it even went to the expert review team, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we would do in that scenario would be the way that we solicit for FIP initiative applications is that we have a consultation, a formal consultation with interested partners. And where part of what that consultation includes is to talk about where they propose to be working. And if we identified early on that this was in an area that was not associated with the board identified ecological priorities, we would try to nip that one in the bud pretty early. So we hopefully would not get to a stage where an application was submitted that did not address a board identified ecological priority.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. And I guess the same thing would go for if a partnership was high performing, that would also be part of that conversation that you would, that initial kind of consultation.
That's a really good question. So the current criterion B, actually A as well, kind of gets at that high performing partnership question that Chris asked. So that's where we have folks that we've recruited to our expert review team that have really good expertise in what makes partnerships tick. And we rely on them and ecological reviewers to help, I think, suss out the criteria A and the new criteria A and B around sort of the partnership capacity and high performing partnerships. So I see two hands, Haley, and then we'll go to Colin.
Yeah, hopefully this isn't jumping ahead, but since we're talking about what would potentially be the new B, I think that this would benefit from more detail. I think performance history feels really vague to me, and I'm sure that this is defined probably in detail more somewhere else. But I mean, is it performance history of conducting outreach, or is it a performance history of moving the ecological needle, forward in a collaborative way? Like, I think there just some level of detail there might be helpful. I understand there's that balance of like detail and leaving it open-ended enough. And then the other thing that I had a question on is the word composition of the partnership also feels really vague to me. Like, is OWEB wanting to make sure that there's a diversity of voices at the table as a part of the partnership? Are you wanting to make sure that it's locally led but supported by agencies? Like, just the word composition, is more just kind of like a noun there. It doesn't really describe like what you're evaluating on and looking for in regards to composition.
Yeah, I think great questions and feedback. Good. Yeah, good notes. Thanks, Julian. So yeah, this will be, I think, a place we can work on beefing up that language a bit. So thanks. We'll go Colin and then Brad.
Thanks. Yeah, well, I definitely agree with what Haley said about B, and I would even add one more way that I have found it unclear, which is it the performance history as a partnership, or are you evaluating the performance history of the individuals, especially if it's a new partnership that's coming together? And then just to go back and dig in a little bit more on what Chris's first concern there was, you said, hopefully ineligible projects wouldn't get put before the review team, but is there actually a process? Because I think sometimes people can be stubborn about what they think is is eligible even after some of these meetings, or what they think is a strong partnership even after some of the initial meetings maybe give some like, whoa, slow down there. So just want to make sure that there is a process if the review team that's somewhere, so the review team isn't going to be spending their time reviewing an ineligible proposal.
Yeah, that's a good comment. I mean, we've had, like I said, the formal consultations, but those are not a part of these rules right now, and we could consider adding them. And what all would be then included in a consultation.
Right. I guess where I'm coming from is, if it comes to the review team, now there is no criteria to point to and say, well, it's not ineligible project, and so it shouldn't get funded. And so it would just go straight to the board. I mean, if it was well written and addressed theory of change and did all that stuff well. So,
well, I mean, it would have to, you know, meet all these other evaluation criteria. But I think what you're saying is just you don't want to get to a place where somebody or a partnership writes an application that we feel doesn't meet that eligibility bar, and that would be problematic. So yeah, I agree. I did see a question in the chat about a history of OWEB rejecting applications as ineligible, and I can't think of any, but I would also turn to other OWEB staff to jog my memory if I'm wrong.
I don't think we have under the FIP program. In other programs we have. Generally, though, we're very we're very flexible about determining eligibility, because if there's even the slightest of questions, we don't want to kick something out from being reviewed. I think under the FIP program, what we have in the rules back in section 40, the eligibility section, those criteria are fairly clear as to what's eligible to apply for a FIP. And you know, we have definitions of some of the things that are included here, but really it's just identifying one of the 7 priorities implemented by a high performing partnership, which means you've got a governance structure and an SAP, and that you've demonstrated 25% matches being sought. That's it. That's the bar for entry, and we like to keep that fairly open, because again, we don't want staff to be kicking out applications that maybe should be reviewed, and so we prefer to keep it that way to the extent that we can. Agree that during the consultation, that's a good time to talk about a lot of these things. I think we probably don't want to put too much in rule about what happens at a consultation, because that is an opportunity to have some back and forth and test things out. If I may, I know Audrey's got a hand up too, so I think she has a comment about this, but I wanted to revisit the performance history language, performance history and composition being vague, and I wanted to test this out because you know, the way this process works, we'll come back to you next time with some suggested language. But around performance history and composition, from my perspective, we are looking at performance history in terms of this group of organizations has a history of being able to make decisions that are critical to a successful partnership. And that if it's a brand new partnership with no performance history, this is one of a bunch of criteria. They wouldn't have a lot of strengths in this criteria because they don't have a track record. It's possible that they could excel in some of these other criteria. The composition piece, that's around one of the open solicitation criteria that we have for restoration grants is, are the appropriate partners at the table. And so that's really what this one is getting at. To achieve the ecological outcomes that you're looking for, are the right organizations members of this partnership? Is there an obvious key organization that should be working with this partnership that's absent? You know, that would be something called out in review. So just wanted to offer those comments while I had the floor. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Art. Brad, you've been very patient.
Yeah, it's just a small one, and it's following up on what Haley and Colin mentioned, and Eric just touched on as well. Is that performance history, I think in this section is not self-evident what that means. And I think Eric just described as really a record of decision-making, which is kind of, what I wanted to say is make sure we tie that back to the definitions, the high-performing partnership. And I have trouble with this definition. I didn't want to go backward today, though, and I don't remember discussing it last time, but the formal decision-making process resulting in an effective performance history. That definition is more in line with what Eric just said in terms of we want to establish basically a track record, I'd call it. If you look at it in isolation down below, to me, that may mean an ecological performance history or something different. So just making sure we're clear on what we're getting at there.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks, Brad. And I'm hearing to make sure that it's aligned with the definition as well, the high performing partnership up above.
Yeah, and I think that definition maybe could be clearer, but I think if it's really what Eric Williams was just saying is an established means, and a record of making decisions among partners, call it that.
Okay. Thanks, Brad. All right, Audrey.
Yeah, thanks. Just a reflection. When Jillian and Eric Hartstein kind of talked about eligibility and the removal of that criterion extent to which the initiative addresses the ecological priority, just kind of a reflection that I had when I heard the questions that came up. It seemed like maybe there's an implication that part of that eligibility check is looking at the actual map, the distribution of the FIP initiative. That's one thing that I thought when I heard what staff could do as part of an eligibility check, and maybe that helps to call that out. At this time, just an observation as well. It seems like having that word extent in the old language was confusing because it had reviewers going down a path that was difficult for them to kind of describe qualitatively the extent to which the proposal would make progress toward the priority. But really, maybe what staff are saying for eligibility is just simply around the geography of the proposed initiative.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Audrey. Okay, good discussion. And as Eric said, we can definitely work on some language. And Eric, I hope you wrote down what you said for the new B. Okay, cool. And then moving down to our new C, which is now the extent to which the theory of change incorporates sound science and effective planning to support the proposed initiative. It's a little confusing seeing all the track changes and everything here. So this is replacing a criterion that says that the applications will be evaluated on the scientific basis and planning tools that support the proposed initiative. So we're adding some more detail to that criterion, including the theory of change. And Leah, go ahead.
Yeah, I had a question about this one, and it's been a little bit since I've reviewed a FIP application or looked at one. So I know that there are the theory of change diagrams and that OWEB has produced for each of the priorities, but this is talking more about the application itself and like what additional science or backing the partnership kind of uses to describe their specific theory of change, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, it is. The theory of change is now a required component of the strategic action plan. So one of the things that we've kind of gone back and forth on is how to include that strategic action plan in the evaluation, because oftentimes it's very long, and we want to make sure that we honor the time and effort that partnerships are putting into their strategic action plan, including the theory of change, which is a major piece of their SAP. So having that SAP be that kind of, or the theory of change being the evaluative component of their strategic action plan. So rather than having reviewers go through and kind of read through a 300 or 400 page strategic action plan document, making that theory of change be kind of front and center. But I'll stop and see if there's anything else from OWEB staff on this particular criterion.
I think Jillian's note there does it, making it clear that it's the initiative's theory of change rather than the general one.
Yeah. Thanks, Jillian. Okay. So we'll move down to, oh, Colin, I see your hand up.
Yeah, it's just looking a little bit, because I was looking at the OWEB theories of change and some of the description in the strategic action plan guidance. And I was just curious a little bit. So I looked at the effective planning verbiage in this evaluation criteria, and I guess I had always sort of thought of the theories of change really as more about like the science and the hypothesis and how you're connecting all of the pieces, and less about the actual planning and implementation part of it. And so I just wonder, I mean, maybe I'm misunderstanding the theory of change. I haven't really been working under this architecture all that long. But just wondering if that was the appropriate words to use for effective planning.
So Colin, where are you with the effective planning? I'm sorry.
Yeah, right
Okay,
there
effective
in
planning
the
there.
new C, right?
Okay.
So I don't know. I guess I would have thought the extent to which a theory of change incorporates sound science to support the proposed initiative, because that's how I understood the theory of change. And then the planning
Okay.
comes from all the other parts of the SAP and the FIP application and all that.
Okay. Yeah, I gotcha.
I like that.
So would you suggest keeping effective planning somewhere in there, but just not linking it directly to the theory of change?
I mean, obviously, yeah, effective planning is an important part of this, but I haven't looked exactly at where else it might go.
So you can, like, I'm just, yeah, we can wordsmith, but something like the extent to which effective planning and, well, I was going to say, and the theory of change, but we can work on it.
Yeah, it just might help reviewers look at the theory of change as like scientific basis framework,
Yeah.
I guess.
Great. Yeah. Good comment. I see Brad and Audrey both have hands up. I don't know which order. So you guys arm wrestle for it.
I'll go in front of Audrey just because we'll stay here forever. I think I agree with what Colin said, but I also, I'm no theory of change expert, but I remember there being a feasibility component to that process as well. And so there, to me, there is a bit of planning or practicality baked into it, at least as we did it in my experiences. And so I think the theory of change should be, incorporate sound science by definition, I guess, in a way. And I'm not making a suggestion, but the extent to which the theory of change supports the proposed initiative, you might just say that and have their theory of change incorporate all of the components, whether it's science or feasibility or, whatever, because it does seem to go beyond the pure science. I mean, there's a lot of science that would support actions that aren't really feasible in the real world. So anyway, not a big deal. I do. Yeah, that's all I've got.
Okay, thanks, Brad. Okay, go ahead, Audrey.
Yeah, I've just been thinking about C and D here, and just an observation. It seems like we're saying the extent to which the theory of change supports the project, addresses sound science or incorporates sound science is one piece. And it seemed to me like the effective planning piece maybe goes with D. There's a lot of thought that's gone into looking at the work plan component of the initiative application. And I'll drop a link to the SAP guidance document in the chat, since we've been talking about it a fair amount.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Audrey. And it's a good segue to move into D, which we could potentially incorporate that effective planning language. So here we're suggesting that applications be evaluated on the extent to which conservation actions, conservation outputs, as defined in definitions, described in the proposed work plan, will make progress towards ecological outcomes, again, as defined up above. So, Brad, is your hand still up from your previous comment, or do you have a new one? Oh, okay. So how do folks feel about this definition, or I'm sorry, this evaluation criterion? Okay. So what we can do is I think we have some good discussion here on the effective planning language, and we'll talk as OWEB staff about where best to add that, because I think we're hearing that it's important, but probably not in its current location here. And the remaining criterion in this section is now the new F, which the major edit here is that we moved the catalyze additional investments, which was in the, I guess, the new A down here, as we felt that it better fit in this in F, because we were talking about funding in this section anyway, and so moving the catalyze additional investments, because that's really more appropriate than engaging the community and ability to partner, we felt.
Eric, I think we missed one. We have two that are labeled D somehow in the auto formatting, but I think we skipped the process.
Oh, yeah, we did.
Here.
Yeah.
But I also,
So,
while I'm talking, I do think that this, well, I think we have the wrong word here, but keep going with it.
Okay. So yeah, I'll see if there's any questions on this moving catalyze additional investments language down to the new F, and then thanks, Jillian. We'll pop back up to the second D. So don't see any hands raised right now for catalyze additional investments. I do see something in the chat about, should say output. So it looks like Jillian's on top of that. Okay, so I guess we'll move up to this new E, extent to which the partnership demonstrates a process to track conservation outputs that are aligned with ecological outcomes. Any questions on that? Oh, yeah.
Less a question. I liked adding the definitions for conservation outputs and actions in the earlier part, and I recognize that the word measurable kind of got like pulled out into those definitions and taken away from other places for alignment. But I just wonder, I wonder if something's lost with not having that word in the evaluation criteria somewhere. For it's just a general reflection that like tracking what we're doing is good, but part of the FIP idea I thought was kind of getting a measurable, like moving the needle in some of these ecological priorities. And I worry if we're de-emphasizing it by like burying it in some of these definitions. So just a reflection. I don't know if I'm decided on where I would put it either, but a thought.
Yeah, thanks for that. Any reaction to that? Yeah, go ahead, Eric.
Well, I'll take a stab at this one because I think we all struggle with it. And I know that our board and past and present FIP partnerships all are pretty clear that in the time frame of FIP investment, we're not likely to see measurable change in ecological outcomes. And I think that was the kind of force behind removing the word measurable. The key there is progress toward outcomes. And, you know, that's, you're kind of tracking your outputs and relying on your theory of change to produce those outcomes. So if the theory of change isn't sound, then yeah, we're in trouble. If the theory of change is sound and we're tracking the actions and outputs, I think the philosophy here is we are going to make progress toward measurable outcomes. It just might not be seen in the lifetime of the FIP investment. And I think that's what has made this particular language really challenging for us up to now.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. Okay. Brad, did you ever
Well,
hear that?
yeah, I would just, I think Leah's got a good point, but I would just agree, having been through this, you know, we are, and I'm not sure whether the question had to do with outcomes or outputs. Obviously, outcomes is defined as measurable up above in the strategic action plan guidance you brought over. So we have that measurable, but are we talking really about ecological outcomes? And then I would agree with Eric that we faced, at least in my experience, difficulty measuring that piece. Again, if everything's solid behind there, you know, in terms of your theory of change, your actions and your outcomes, you should, in theory, get to the outcomes, but it's hard to track in that time frame. But I'm not sure exactly whether that was the question.
Yeah. Okay. Anything else in the evaluation criteria section? Colin. Oh,
just a quick
Colin's still
unmute, and then sorry about that. Just a quick thing about something in E. I mean, it's about the monitoring plan, right? And so not having the word monitoring in that evaluation criteria seems a little obfuscating to me. It's not as clear as it could be, I guess.
So in the new E, not having language about a monitoring plan?
Yeah, I guess, yeah. It just seems like it could be clearer, but I'm biased because I have monitoring in my job title. So
Yeah, and that's kind of gets at what we were talking about a little bit earlier about kind of monitoring versus tracking, making sure that there's a process to track, yet we know that monitoring kind of differs across the partnerships in the state. And, you know, some have really robust monitoring efforts that they're conducting in-house. Others are relying on outside agencies or outside partners to do the monitoring work associated with their initiative. It's just kind of all over the map when it comes to monitoring. That's where we've been a little reticent about including language directly related to monitoring.
That makes sense.
In the evaluation criteria.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I guess I wouldn't push hard to put anything in there. I was just coming from the SAP guidance on a project progress monitoring framework, which is kind of where some of this link the outputs to the outcomes comes from. And so having it, I guess where I was coming from was it would be clear that this is exactly what you're referencing as like, this is the important part of the SAP. But I think it's very fair that that is really different across different partnerships. So,
and thanks, Colin. And Audrey, I see your hand up.
Yeah, thanks. And just to add a little bit to Eric's response and really what you just said, Colin, I think it varies Also, when you look at the different ecological priorities that OWEB has funded, there's a different state of restoration science for some of the ecological priorities. So just to add that to Eric's response.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Audrey. Okay, so anything else in evaluation criteria? Good discussion, and again, thanks, Jillian, for your note taking. I think we definitely have some thinking to do on some of these criteria. But before we move on to our scheduled break, is there anything else we should be considering in this section? Okay, so not seeing anything. Let's take a break. We're still, I think, ahead of schedule, so we'll take 15 minutes and get back at 10:28. Okay, so we are at 10:29. And before we get going, want to just check with folks, see if there's any thoughts that you've had over our break that you'd like to share before we get going into the next sections. Jillian, I see your physical hand raised.
My physical hand was raised, yes. So I was able to see the chat once I stopped sharing, and just wanted to point folks back, if you didn't see Leah's comment about the measurable piece and the, kind of the monitoring piece. And I just wanted to say, I think that we're trying to be really intentional about not putting the that feedback loop on ecological outcomes, not putting that on the shoulders of our FIP partners. They're already doing so much, and we really rely on them for the planning and the implementation. And just, recognizing that feedback loop is important, but in those, parentheses there, outside the FIP program, perhaps. So just to give a little more maybe insight into the proposed changes here around the criteria.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks, Jillian. And thanks for leaving that in the chat too, Leah. Appreciate that. Okay, so let's go to, yep, thanks, Jillian. We're going to go down to the next section, which is 0070, the Focus Investment Partnership Initiative Expert Review process. So we had some suggested edits here. So some of the bigger ones are where we added in the second line that the expert review team will evaluate and rank applications. This is really what the expert review team did during the last review for this most recent cohort of FIPs. And we, I think, all felt that it was an effective way to, in addition to having the evaluation, that the team was putting forward a ranking. And it was, I think, appreciated by all, including our board grants committee that was doing the interview and their own recommendation process. I think they really appreciated having that ranking from the expert review team as well. One thing that OEB staff has talked about a little bit is we don't currently have the expert review team put forward a recommend for funding or do not recommend for funding language to go along with that evaluation and ranking. But wanted to really kind of gauge the RAC's thoughts on if that would be useful, in addition to your thoughts on the proposed revisions in this section.
Just to break the silence, I don't really have a thought on that one. Eric, my gut, without knowing the process, is that fund, do not fund is is not a necessary or helpful piece of the evaluation, but I defer to folks that have, been further along in the process from the review perspective and award perspective. But just as an applicant, again, with no real context, I'm not sure the fund, do not fund piece in itself is helpful if you already have a ranking.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks, Brad. Leah.
Yeah, I guess I was going to ask a question to similarly put it back on maybe some of you all, but I did notice that one of the comments that we got was about this and advocating for making that recommendation. And I guess I wonder, like, since only the top projects are really getting funded anyways, does it matter to maybe really highlight a project as a do not fund on the bottom of the list if that's not likely to come into play anyways? I don't know. But that I was curious whether the OWEB folks that are more familiar with all different applicants think that information would be helpful to the board in making their funding decision. That makes sense.
Yeah, thanks, Leah. And Chris, as a member of the expert review team, maybe you have some thoughts on this as well. I see your hand up.
Yeah, thanks. My tendency, I tend to agree with Brad in the sense that I don't think that there fund no fund would have a lot of value here in the scenarios I can picture. And having served on the expert review team, it seems like, well, for one thing, we typically have more projects than we can fund that would be, good initiatives that would be providing the outcomes that we're looking for. And then in a scenario where there were fewer projects and they could all be funded, it seems like the criteria we have for whether they even qualify for the FIP funding would kind of cover that. And so if they make it through that, even if they were a low ranking, if there were a few projects that came in and one was low ranking, it still would seem like worthy of funding. I guess there are, theoretically, there could be a project that wouldn't be, or initiative that we wouldn't be recommended for funding. I just don't see a very high likelihood of that happening.
Great. Yeah, thanks for those insights, Chris. Colin.
Yeah, just something that when I was looking through both the eligibility evaluation and then this ranking system with the expert review process based on those criteria, just wanted to flag that re-applicants are going to be at a pretty distinct advantage compared to new FIP initiatives. If one of the evaluation criteria is the performance history and competition, and so if that goes into the rankings, then that means you're going to be more likely in future cycles to refund past recipients because they will have, $8 to $12 million and 6-year performance history compared to new projects and new partnerships coming in. And so I don't know if this is the right place to have that discussion, but it's something that I thought was worth flagging, especially if you're going to have your evaluation, if you're going to have your review team rank on the criteria that we talked about earlier. So, and I don't think it's like a problem to refund projects. It just is worth flagging up that you will bias your funding towards programs that have already been funded.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks, Colin. I have some, I think that's a good insight. It has some other thoughts too, which is that I think we've seen partnerships that have come in that have not had a past FIP that have done a really good job of demonstrating how they, as a partnership, perhaps they got a OWEB partnership technical assistance grant in the future that helps them develop a strategic action plan, but have demonstrated how they've been implementing conservation or restoration across their landscape as a partnership without having the benefit of having a FIP. But it's a good, I think it's a good comment and something to think about.
Yeah, I guess the other thing is just thinking in the future, right? I mean, the FIP program hasn't been here for, 50 years, but you can imagine in 2 or 3 decades, a lot of programs would like more partnerships would be re-applicants. And so I guess, I don't know, just looking at it in the long term as well.
Yep.
And leaving
Yeah,
that
totally
space for, and I guess the one other thing too is that in some of the FIP guidance and sort of goals of the program is that this FIP funding would be used to catalyze future investments, and to have the future investment be the same FIP program is a little bit, snake eating its own tail in some ways.
Yeah. I mean, I think and maybe we should suss that out a little bit more in the evaluation criteria, that, the catalyze additional investments is really meant to be additional investments outside of OWEB. Brad, go ahead.
Yeah, I think maybe we'll get further into this, and thanks, Leah, for the reminder that Ken had barely had submitted comments on this. I'd read those over the past couple of days, but I'm anxious to hear Ken. I'm assuming he'll talk about this at the public comment part, but just for purposes of this, he raises the question, or maybe I just don't know. Are we talking about ranking all of the proposals that come in across the ecological priorities, or are we talking about ranking within ecological priorities? I just don't know, and I don't have a sense, having not been directly involved in this stuff in a couple of years, how many applications we're seeing. In other words, do we really have 4 for the same ecological priority that we rank among, or is that across the board, top to bottom, from the entire pool of applications? Anyway, I don't know whether that needs to be, if that's self-evident to the review team and other folks, or whether that's an issue we should clarify.
Yeah, thanks, Brad. We're referring to ranking of the entire pool of applications that have come in.
That's what I assume. Thanks.
Eric, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. I'm going to put a link in the chat here to a document on our website. We've done a lot of analysis on partnerships specifically. And this is speaking to some of the comments on high-performing partnerships, and Colin's comment specifically about, does this give a leg up to someone who's had a partnership, who's had a FIP before? We have done a lot of thinking about what is a high-performing partnership, and we have recognized how critical that is to the success of a long-term investment. So I suppose you could say that, yes, it could potentially give a prior funded FIP partnership a leg up. in this criteria, so long as they did well with their earlier FIP and have shown that they continue to be high performing. The other thing I would say about it is, as with all of our OWEB program evaluation criteria, it really is, rather than being a points-based system, and one particular criteria being disqualifying or not, it really is which applications meet this constellation of criteria the best. And so you could be meeting some of the other criteria really well, and maybe that one not as well, or vice versa. It really depends on the strength of it as a whole. But I would encourage everybody to take a look at the partnership learning project documents. I just put part 3 up there. There's a couple other preceding parts too. This is sort of the magic sauce that we're trying to evaluate here, that makes these partnerships effective. And I think we still have a lot to learn about it, but I think the longer we have experience in the FIP program, the more we realize the importance of the partnership dynamic, and whether or not partnership has moved kind of on that trajectory towards fully collaborative partnerships that are capable of making the kinds of decisions you need to make, and working for the group as a whole, or are they retaining sort of project level partnerships? It's not, and that's not a judgment on one's better than the other, because you've got to start somewhere. But I think it's a recognition of how important that criteria is to predicting success over 10 years of investment, 6 years of investment, 10 years of project implementation. So I just wanted to add that comment to the discussion.
Great. Yeah, I think that's really good clarification, and thanks for popping that link in the chat, Eric. Okay. Anything else in this the 0070 section? Jillian?
Thank you. I think it was Leah who had said, curious to see if we get back to the question around including the fund or the recommendation or do not recommend for funding for the expert review team. And just, I think from staff perspective, or maybe just my perspective, I do think it could potentially be helpful to the grants committee and to the board in making their funding decisions if there was something in addition to the ranking. Because and I don't know that we've necessarily been in this situation before, but if there were a situation where we had enough funding, say, to fund 5 of the initiatives that came in, and the 5th ranked one was actually maybe underdeveloped, that there were some concerns that really were maybe potentially fatal flaws in their success, it would carry a much stronger, like the grants committee and the board really would consider this one's not recommended, they're not quite ready yet, above just like, they would consider that harder, or they'd think about that more than just it ranked 5th. So just something else to consider in whether we include that or not.
Yeah, that's a good point, Jillian. And I generated a couple of additional hands, so we'll go Haley and then Denise.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Jillian, especially from the applicant's perspective. I think being ranked low is just like, oh, maybe it was a crazy competitive round. And that is very different feedback than you're not quite meeting this high bar for this type of application. And so I actually feel that distinction of communication is really important for FIP applicants, because I think it really will direct that applicant on how to do better and to really enter that FIP program you know, that's appropriate. So I'm super supportive of that. I actually think that's really important.
Okay. Looks like saw some thumbs up and agreement in the comments. Denise.
Yeah, I was just gonna ask if we change if people would feel more comfortable with the language, if we change it from recommend. So the suggestion was recommend or do not recommend. And if we change that from recommend to not at this time, if people would feel better about that language, because then it's giving people feedback, just as everyone's been talking about, Haley's comments in particular, that, you know, it's helpful feedback for the applicant to get, that it wasn't just that it was low, it's that this isn't quite developed enough yet. And then they could get the specific feedback around what would need to be there in order for it to be ready to fund. And I think that's different from something that's just flat out, you know, not eligible. And as we've said in the previous conversations this morning, that hasn't happened yet in the FIP. But there's always, you know, a future scenario where it could. And then I just wanted to say one thing really quick, since I have the mute off, about Colin's comment about, you know, 20 or 30 years into the future. Just a reminder that we look at these rules every 5 years. So if there's things that need to be changing in future decades, we'll have the opportunity to be making those changes. The rules we're making now aren't going to be set in stone forever. And then just a reminder that our application does include 2 questions that repeat FIPs are required to answer that new initiative applicants don't answer, and that those questions are to help the reviewers understand what's been achieved with that first round of funding and why additional investment is needed. And there's quite a bit of discussion around, you know, around that. So it's not a slam dunk if you're a FIP who's reapplying, that you're just automatically assumed to be, you know, really high performing, have all your ducks in a row, and have, you know, an amazing grasp on your work plan and the work that needs to be done to achieve your ecological objectives. That's not a slam dunk. Like, the bar is pretty high for folks to be able to demonstrate why that first, you know, and that first investment wasn't enough investment and why additional investments needed. So the application has questions about that. And that's something FIP staff can think about, whether there needs to be anything in the rules about that. But it is in the application. So just wanted to mention that. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for that context. Super helpful, Denise. And then your proposal about recommended for funding or not recommended for funding at this time, maybe a little bit softer type of language. So Haley, I see your hand up.
Yeah, I was just going to push back on that. I think clear is kind. And I think that if a partnership is not meeting the bar to competitively receive funding for a FIT program, I think you should be really clear about that. And I think that is a do not fund. I think particularly that's the same language that OEB uses in open solicitation, et cetera. It does not mean that a project cannot come back, you know, integrate feedback and come back. And I think you should be consistent and clear. I think the FIP application process is extremely arduous, and I think it's kind of leading someone on a little bit to really soften that language. So I would recommend being really clear.
Yeah, thanks, Haley. Colin, I see your hand up.
Yeah, Denise, thanks for that context. I had seen those questions in the FIP application. So yeah, and they are actually some interesting questions about how the outcomes changed, which, you know, maybe given discussion about how hard it is to measure outcomes, I don't know, that might be revisited in the application at some point too. But I just wanted to also just agree with Haley. You know, I was involved in a FIP application that wasn't funded in this most recent biennium, and it was difficult to parse out why it was ranked low in some ways. You know, it would have been really nice to have a do not fund, your partnership's just not there yet, which is, I think, our actual takeaway. And what we kind of got was, well, there's only funding for 4 in year 5, and there's not really anywhere on the sheet that says you're not ready for it, and here's why, and here's what you need to do to improve. And we did eventually get that information just in consultation with Jillian and others, but especially getting the initial review from the review team, we spent a few months trying to prepare for the meeting, kind of shrugging our shoulders and saying, can we even do anything about this? And if we had a do not fund, we could have maybe spent that time more effectively, you know, strengthening the partnership, getting the decision-making protocols in place, all that fun stuff that really sets us up for success in the future. So just a comment from a recent experience.
Good. Yeah, thanks, Colin. That's really helpful, and appreciate your candor there. Chris.
Yeah, thanks all. This has been a good discussion. I think I've seen it more from the perspective of a reviewer in the past, and it's nice to hear from applicants and kind of how they're processing this information that's provided. I think it's really helpful. I do think after hearing some more talk about this, I think there's a difference between what we've experienced in the reviews we've had and kind of these situations that could come up in the future that I think we should be prepared for. I haven't seen a situation where there was something that was not funded that was clearly a do not recommend funding for this, but we have had a few cases where they were, I guess, clearly kind of underdeveloped, and if there hadn't been as many applications, it would have been useful to have some way of signaling to the board that this group is not quite ready for prime time. So I guess I would kind of change my thinking here as we've discussed this, and there probably is some carefully worded kind of distinction we need to make between projects that are low ranking and ones that really aren't ready to be funded. The last thing I would say about this is that some of those projects that were not quite ready for funding, I do think there's a gray area there where I think if those partnerships had received funding, I think that they would have and have that additional resources available. I think they would have been able to implement actions that would have achieved outcomes. And sometimes it's difficult to kind of disentangle the fact that a group may have not had a lot of external support and resources and capacity that the FIP would have then filled that in, and then they would have been able to make it to that. And I'm thinking of some very specific circumstances here that have to do with specific applications that I'm not going to go into, but I do think that sometimes there's a chicken and egg issue here with FIP funding and kind of capacity and ability to do the work. So thanks all.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. Okay, so I think we're hearing that we should have some language around that recommend, do not recommend, and we can kind of wordsmith how that looks, but for it to be clear and consistent, you know, for the applicants so that they know where they stand. And Brad, I see your hand up.
Yeah, sorry, Eric, I didn't want to interrupt you. I guess then the question is, what's the relationship between ranking and the recommendation, you know, the do not fund? Is the ranking itself, and maybe this is directed to Chris or someone that's been on, you know, on this technical or expert review team, you know, is it difficult to rank among FIPs that are addressing different ecological priorities? Would it be easier to give a fund, no fund recommendation? Does the ranking add value to the process? Those are just questions I have as we look at this in the next, you know, the next section. so I don't need an answer, just posing the question. What use does the next level of review make of both of those pieces of information?
Okay, yeah, that's probably a good segue into the next section, which involves what kind of happens with those evaluations and rankings. And that's in the FIP initiative funding recommendation process in 0080. So what we have here is the proposed edits kind of reflect that OAB staff will review the results from the expert review team process and make a funding recommendation to a board committee. And we've talked about this as staff just to make sure we have a little better clarity for folks that are reading these rules to see exactly what OAB staff are doing here. And the comment that Jillian just put in the chat really kind of reflects how this has occurred over the life of the program, which is that OAB staff, and this would be perhaps an edit here to this in 1A. So it would read, OAB staff shall review the results from the expert review team and make a funding recommendation based on the board adopted spending plan item for focused investment partnership initiatives to a board committee. So it's essentially looking at how much the board has approved in their biennial spending plan for new FIP initiatives for that biennium. And then taking that ranking, looking at what was requested from those partnerships, and then just doing the math. So if there's, I don't know, $8 million the board has put forward for new FIPs, OAB staff is basically just looking at, well, there's 5 initiatives that have been ranked here, 1 through 5. There's funding for 3, given the amount of money in the spending plan line item and that the board has adopted. So I'll stop there, see if there's any questions on this process and what we have recommended here in the comment.
Eric, I just have a question. Did I miss something on why that last sentence is struck out about providing the kind of the background to the applicants and board?
Oh, yeah, that's up in, we included that in 0070.
Oh, yeah. Okay, yeah.
Last sentence. Yeah, sorry.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, we'll give folks a moment to think about it. Yeah, Jesse.
Not really a question, Eric, but I'm just wondering how, if the expert review team is going to make a funding recommendation, how that's going to jive now with the OEB staff making a funding recommendation too. How would you envision those working together?
Yeah, really how they have worked is the recommendation or do you say the expert review team evaluation and kind of what they put forward there to staff? Was that right, Jesse?
Yeah, because I think the consensus earlier was that they would provide a fund or do not fund recommendation now.
Yeah. And how that would work with the funding recommendation from staff. I mean, I think staff would look at that evaluation from the expert review team, which would include if we had language around recommended for funding or do not recommend for funding. I don't see that changing anything. I mean, if there was a recommend for funding, that would be put forward by staff to the board committee, and similarly with a do not recommend for funding recommendation from the expert review team. So it would align a little bit like our open solicitation grant program, I think.
And maybe a follow-up question too, Eric, would the board then have both recommendations, funding recommendations, the one from the expert review team and the one from the staff?
Yes.
Okay.
See, Brad and Haley. So we'll go Brad first.
Yeah, I think Eric and I know this is the intent here, but I think these are critical pieces of information for applicants, and yeah, we ought to be clear and make sure that the applicant is seeing and understanding all of these various recommendations. And I assume all of this recommendation we're talking about right now, the staff recommendation, will be in a staff report. I don't know that, I guess, but I think it's just critical transparency in decision making. And then could you shift back up to where that that same note, the OWEB staff recommendation shall be provided? Okay, and you put that up above. So are those the same thing? The OWEB staff recommendation and the expert review process and ranking?
In practice, it is, because it all goes
Okay.
into the staff report that goes to the board grants committee, the full board, and also the applicants.
Yeah, maybe just making sure we're clear on all of this stuff as it's.
Yeah.
So people aren't thinking there's a decision that they don't have access to, to the reasoning, but.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying, and maybe we took it out of the wrong place when we removed the OWEB staff recommendation shall be provided to applicants and the board. Maybe that's where we want to keep that, because it really reflects that full recommendation process rather than removing it down in 0080, keeping it in there, because the way it reads, I could see it somebody reading that and saying we're not getting all the information at that point.
Yeah, that's what I'm getting at. I know you ultimately we will, or applicants will, but yeah, making it clear that there's nothing lurking somewhere.
Yeah. Okay. Good point. Haley, go ahead.
I'm gonna preface this by saying that I feel like this comment is a little all over the place, but and transparently, it's based off of some of the things that happened in the 2022 cohort award. There was the board level conversation was very different than the process of the expert review team and the staff recommendation. And from an applicant's perspective, it was extremely concerning how that entire conversation played out. And it really questioned a lot of kind of roles, responsibilities, and really truly what is going into making that funding decision. From the applicant's perspective, it appears that what goes into that decision is, are you meeting the eligibility requirements? If so, how are you ranking in terms of that evaluation criteria, which is conducted by an expert review panel who is, from an applicant's perspective, is in those roles because of their specific expertise on the evaluation criteria. And then the staff recommendation is, and it seems like that was just again articulated by you all, but it's based off of, okay, we have this much money, because that is, there is an operational piece to managing the budget, which is on the OEB staff side. And so it goes, here's our recommendation is essentially maintaining the integrity of that expert review process in terms of the evaluation criteria, and just saying, board, you have this, this is the funds you have available, therefore this is where this would lie in the ranking. When it goes above and beyond that to the board, and they're potentially, able to make a decision that falls outside of the expert and the staff recommendation. I'm a part of a board run organization. I also understand boards have authority, and there's place and intention behind that, and I don't want to undermine that, but it really undermines the rest of the process and the transparency when that is completely shifted based off of individual perspectives on the OEB board of directors at that time, much of which is around people who have relationships in different parts of geography around the state, is what it can appear from the outside. And so I think that we're all looking to OEB and feel that OEB has a very strong track record of outlining a very transparent process so that we can all compete within that process to the best of our abilities for funding. And when that can really stray what feels like potentially far from that, it's really concerning. So I think just kind of, a little bit off of Brad's prior comment, but the transparency is really critical. And I think if you're going to define a eligibility review process, and you're going to provide transparency on that, you're going to define the review criteria and process and be transparent about the rankings of that. If there's going to be, significant ability to sway beyond that, as applicants, we all need to understand the reasons behind, like, that process should be equally transparent. That's kind of hard to articulate, but 2022 was really concerning for a lot of people around the state. And I think it's important that we just talk about it and think about that in the context of reviewing these two sections, because I think it's really where that plays out.
Yeah, thanks, Haley. And I think your comment was well articulated. I understood it quite well. And one comment, and it gets to the rankings piece of all this. Like what we had before was after the expert review team met, they would agree on, and people saw this in the evaluations, like an overall, each criterion was rated with a high minus, medium plus, medium, and so on. And then kind of everything was bundled together, and applicants were given kind of that same high minus, medium plus. And everybody was really at that, you know, high minus, medium plus. And it was really hard for, I think, anybody, including our board, to separate out the high minuses from the medium pluses. And I think the ranking piece that we've utilized in the last cohort really helped with that. But, you know, clearly there's still some work to do, and I don't want to take away from any of that, but I thought that was helpful. And the way that this is laid out now would be the expert review would have their evaluations and recommendations. OED staff would take that, look at the board spending plan, and then put forward the recommendation based on the available funding. And then the board committee, as we see here in B and C, would be interviewing the core partners of each partnership and putting forward a recommendation to the full board. And that could be a place where they would look at the spending plan and say, you know, it says $8 million in the board spending plan. And there's funding for 3 partnerships right now, but we were really impressed by this 4th, and so that would take us over to say $9 million. But we really think that's important for the board to consider, and that's what they would be then putting forward to the full board. Would be, you know, potentially adding an additional partnership to be funded. So that's sort of the process that we'd have written out here for recommending partnerships. But I'll stop and see if there's any other questions or reflections. And go ahead, Haley.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask a question on that because I don't think that's what happened in 2022. There was actually a board was thinking of swapping the order of the rankings. And so, you know, maybe this is just transparency and what is the board committee doing that is different than the other parts of the review process? And if it really is just, do we want to spend within budget, or do we want to spend, you know, above that because we feel like it's really justified and important? Is that the purview of their review, or is it much broader than that, where they could, you know, change the expert ranking, which is based off of, you know, ecological outcomes and partnership? Like, I think that needs to be really clear, and I don't feel like that is clear.
Okay, yeah, let's see, Julie making that note. And Eric, and then Colin.
Thanks. Yeah, Haley, I think that's an important thing to talk about and understand. And in fact, our board just had a lengthy discussion last week at its board meeting about what is the decision space of the board. Are they a rubber stamp? What do they get to? What arena do they get to play in? And the same applies to the committee in this case. And what I would say to that is, yes, the committee could move the rankings around. That, you know, they need something to start with, and that's what the expert review team is giving them. If we went right from the expert review team without, the staff providing the recommendation. That would have to be done in a public session, the expert review team, and that, of course, would ruin any attempt we have at having open and honest conversations and review. But the expert review ranking is the starting point. The board committee, based on their interviews, and so I think one assumes there that if they're changing the ranking, they're hearing something in their interviews and the answers to the questions they're asking that prompts them to make a change in that ranking, and that is done publicly. All of the board committee's work is done in a public process, so it is therefore transparent. And then that recommendation goes to the full board. The full board can certainly do the same thing. I think it's less likely that the full board would change the committee's ranking, but it's certainly possible. And that is their decision space, so long as they're grounding their decisions in the criteria that are in the rules. And that's what the board spent a bunch of time talking about last week. That they certainly can do something different than what the staff recommends. The committee can do something different than what the staff recommends. The board can do something different, but it has to be grounded in criteria and ultimately in statute as well. They can't make changes for some reason that is outside of their statutory authority and what's in their administrative rules. So I hope that helps, but it's because otherwise the committee and the board are just a rubber stamp. If they have to do exactly what's provided to them from this review process, we don't really need a board. They do get to exercise some judgment there, but our goal in setting this process up is to make that exercise of judgment in a public way as transparent as possible, so that people aren't left questioning why they decided what they did. And we agree that the 2022 process was clunky, and that's why we significantly changed it for 2024. And the feedback we got was that it was much improved. So point taken, certainly, on your comments about how 2022 went. So, thank you.
Yeah, if I could just a quick follow-up, Eric, that was really helpful. And I wonder maybe could that be clearer here? Like, could it just say, something, because Eric, you really clearly articulated that, like, yeah, the board can do that. And I agree, it shouldn't be a rubber stamp, but could it maybe just clearly state that they will be reviewing the same evaluation criteria and the same information that was provided to the expert review? Like, I think maybe that feels obvious, and maybe everyone felt that the board really stuck to that in 2022. I think there might be some nuanced perspective to whether or not they really completely stuck to the evaluation criteria. But I think maybe just even in rule stating that, because then applicants know too, of like, the board might have a different perspective on the effectiveness of this partnership over that partnership, or this ecological merit versus that one. But I think maybe just adding that level of detail could be helpful.
Yeah, I think we can do that, Haley, and I see Jillian's got a note there to that effect. So we'll let us think about how best to do it. It might be just as simple as adding the reference to the criteria section in that language, but we can certainly come back next time with some specifics.
Right, and good discussion. Okay, anything else on the recommendation process? Okay, not seeing any. We'll go through this last section here before we get to public comment. So this is the board's funding decision. And the proposed revisions here are removing what was the board may fund an initiative in whole or in part. And we suggested removing this language as funding initiatives in part is really challenging. And it is one, you have an application that and a budget that calls for a whole suite of activities, and trying to do something on the fly to adjust to, oh, you don't have $2 million, you now have $1.7 million is really challenging. So we're suggesting to remove that language here, that it would just be funding initiatives as they were proposed. And so the new language also includes the 6 years of funding for each initiative, so 3 biennia of funding. But we have removed the $4 million cap for each biennium, and instead replace that with language that prior to soliciting for FIP initiatives, that the board will determine the maximum amount for biennial awards. And what we're trying to get at here is things like inflationary pressures exist, and having a dollar amount that is static in administrative rule makes it challenging to be flexible when we're hit with things like inflation. So what we think would occur here is that the board would, as a part of their biennial spending plan, would say, we want to have X amount dedicated to FIP initiatives, and with a maximum amount of X. And it would be, some amount that is reflective of inflation. So if it's $4 million in 2016, when these first rules were passed, it would be bumped up to, $4.5 million or something to that effect. We'd have to just look at some of the inflation calculators to make that recommendation to the board. But that's the intent, is to remove the dollar amount static in rule and have it be a little more flexible for the board. And I'll see if there's any questions, comments on this one. Okay. Look good? So a couple of head nods. So Brad.
I hate to stop us with this momentum, but the board seeks investment. Now I've minimized that. Sorry, for up to 6 years for each initiative. That's just stating a policy interest of the board in a 6-year time frame.
Yes.
And of course, conditioning that on funding availability. Yeah, I just wonder if there's a different way to put it. It's obviously it's not a huge deal, but the board is seeking investment for up to 6 years. I don't quite understand the language, but I'm not hung up on it. Just maybe I'll offer something.
Yeah, Brad, that really has to do with the board is unable to commit funding that it doesn't have in the current biennial budget. And so it's a way that the board can express their intent without committing funding that legally they can't commit until each successive biennium. And so that prompts the reporting and review process at the end of each biennium, and then the board decides, okay, we're ready for biennium 2, this FIP's ready for biennium 2 or 3, but they simply can't commit that money up front.
Yeah, for sure.
It's
yeah,
outside the budget.
Okay.
Period.
Yeah, thanks.
And then the up to 6 years, this might seem like minutia, but we have had one initiative that was 5 years. So, you know, they can always go less than 6 years. Okay, so that concludes the sections that we wanted to get through today. You know, really appreciate the discussion. We've got a little bit of work to do between now and the next meeting. So thank you all really for that. We have a half hour left, and I know we went past our second break, but now is the time for verbal public comment. So folks can stick around for another half hour without having a break. We'd like to move on to the verbal public comment if there is any that folks want to put forward. So if you are here in attendance and want to offer verbal comment, can you please put your either virtual or physical hand up? Okay, Ken. And Daniel. Okay, all right. So Ken and Daniel, did I miss any hands? Not seeing any additional. We'll start with you, Ken. Go ahead.
Thank you. I wrote out a whole laudatory piece last night to explain how well I think you've done in trying to simplify this process. But there are two remaining things that I want to harp on a little bit. One is being clear about who the core partners are. You've done a significant job in trying to accommodate that, but it still ends up being a long list of folks. And as others have mentioned, what about adding other folks? And I know that you've allowed that in the past, but I think there's one way to deal with that, and that's trying to be clear about who would be the primary contacts with OWEB, who would be the managing partner, who would handle the contracting within the partnership, and who would be the primary contact for OWEB. And that's why I suggested the language that I did, because that would be very clear about who OWEB staff would be interacting with. I think it's a minor matter. I think the language you've suggested could also work. It just, I think it would be shorter. But the application itself will list all of the partners in the work plan, etc. The issue that I have the greatest concern about comes out of the clusterfuck that happened in 2022. When you're ranking different types of ecological objectives against one another with the expert review panel, what comes out of that is you're comparing apples, oranges, kumquats, wingnuts, and so you're comparing very different things. And my notion is that it would be important if you have, for example, 3 oak woodland prairie projects to rank those. They're very comparable. If you have 4 coho proposals, rank those, but then come out of that with, here are the rankings among the same projects, rather than have a unitary ranking system. Because with a unitary ranking system coming out of the expert review panel, it ties the board committee's hands. What we saw in 2022 was that the board committee wrestled with, well, we have different ideas. And that cuts to really the role of the board committee. And my notion is that the board committee is to develop a funding portfolio to address the priorities that the board has identified. And they can choose among those that come out of the expert review panel in any way that they want to match those up with the priorities that the board has set. So that makes a very specific role for the board committee to develop a funding recommendation with the staff, with the limitations on the funding, to go to the board. If you come out with a unitary ranking recommendation from the expert review panel, you basically have made the board committee irrelevant, because as they did in 2022, they could see no way to develop any different kind of portfolio than what was handed to them. And I think that that the comparison among different priorities is artificial on its face. But secondly, I think it is you need to have a specific responsibility of the board committee, and that responsibility should be to develop a portfolio of FIP projects that address the priorities that they feel are important to be dealt with, and given the tool, and they should be given the tools to do that in an open and in clear way. And I understand that there is a strong reliance on the expert review panel. It's just that they're being asked to do comparisons that I think don't make too much sense. We know a lot about coho salmon. We've invested billions in recovery plans, strategic action plans. We don't have that same kind of stuff for estuaries. We don't have that same kind of stuff for the wetlands in the southeast. So you're really trying to compare very different things with very different information backgrounds. So if you do anything, I would take the role of the staff is to carry information from the expert review panel, explain that to the board subcommittee. The board subcommittee or committee, I'm sorry, develops a portfolio recommendation, and then the staff takes that recommendation based on funding availability to the board recommended for funding. That makes logic to me, and it specifies the roles of each group. And now I'll shut up and let you guys do real work. Thanks for the opportunity.
Hey, thank you, Ken. Does anybody have any clarifying questions for Ken before we get on to Daniel? Okay. Yeah, appreciate that, Ken. Daniel.
Hello, everybody,
Welcome.
and thank you for this opportunity. My name is Daniel Newberry, and I want to just mention a couple things about my experience with the Clackamas Partnership, of which I'm a member. We have a current FIP. We're just in our third biennium now. And I sent some written comments in on this, but I thought it might be also useful to talk in person. And I think your discussions earlier in the meeting today about monitoring and the theory of change model fit in really well with what I wanted to say here. Because I remember we spent quite a bit of time with the Bonneville Environmental Foundation early on in our FIP putting together a theory of change model. And adaptive management, as you know, is a big piece of that. But one of the things we've experienced in our FIP is it wasn't until maybe the fourth year until we started to get the kind of monitoring information in enough quantity and enough quality that we could begin to start even thinking about adaptive management. And you know, the FIP is a 6-year process, and that makes total sense in terms of the restoration aspect of it. But when it comes to monitoring, like to maybe throw out to this group because you all have some influence with the OEB board and the rest of the staff. But I'm wondering if there might be a way within the rules or in the way OEB looks at FIPS to think about making a piece of monitoring that extends beyond the 6 years. A couple of years ago, we worked with Audrey on a program that OEB has, the supplemental monitoring program, excuse me, where we could get some funding for an additional 1 year of monitoring, kind of like a year 7 monitoring type of thing, which is how we're handling it. But I'm just wondering if there might be, this point in time when you have a couple of cohorts that have gotten far enough along in the whole process to start thinking about this monitoring question and the timing and how you might be able to memorialize putting that into the way OEB FIPS work in the future. And I'm not sure what that really means. I think it's going to be really interesting for us when we get to year 7, because what we've chosen to do is, rather than we're spending some time doing like this big extra analysis of what we've learned in the first 6 years, in addition to spending a piece of it on actual 7th year monitoring. But just wanted to throw it out to this group that I think it's worth thinking about how you might extend kind of the monitoring framework, the monitoring funding piece for the FIPS beyond 6 years. So that's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Daniel. And yeah, I think it fits well with some of those earlier discussions around monitoring and FIPS. So any clarifying questions for Daniel on those comments? Yeah, thanks again, Daniel. Okay, so our next RAC meeting is August 20th, again at 9 a.m. Got a lot of morning people here, which is great. We'll be working on some of the revisions to the sections that we discussed today. And then we have the next set of rules that will actually take us to the end of the rule set at the next meeting. So expect to do a little bit of back and forth between the past sections that we talked about today and then the remaining sections of the rules on the 20th. And then for the last, I still think we're going to have probably 4 RAC meetings. The last RAC meeting, we'll just go through everything as a set, make sure we dotted all our I's, crossed all our T's, and we'll also be asking some questions about economic impacts of the proposed rules at our very last meeting in September. So I'll stop there, see if there's any questions, last comments. Audrey.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. I've been thinking here. I'd like to, if it's okay with you, just add a couple comments based on largely on what we heard from Daniel, if that's okay. Yeah, I just kind of wanted to clarify for folks, there was a supplemental monitoring offering for those first 2 cohorts of FIPS. And the reason for that was because that SAP guidance that's been referred to a couple of times during this meeting was under development at that time. And so just kind of OEB recognized that those first couple cohorts of FIPS may see some overarching data gaps that they want to address. And then the other comment I wanted to make for folks, for the record, I guess, is OEB is currently exploring kind of what a pilot post-FIP report might look like with one of the first cohort FIPs. So just a couple comments inspired by what we heard. Thank you.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Audrey. Anything else for the good of the order today? Okay, well, thank you again. Great discussion. Really appreciate it. Have a good rest of your day, and we'll chat again here in a few weeks. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.